Picture this. You're a federal prosecutor, sitting in your office on a quiet Tuesday evening when an envelope slides under your door. Inside, there's a photograph of your daughter walking home from school, a bank statement showing $2 million deposited in an offshore account with your name on it, and a simple note. Take the money. Drop the case, everyone wins. Most people would panic. Most people would call for help. Most people would consider their options carefully. But Maria Santos wasn't most people. Instead of fear, she felt something else entirely. A burning determination that would lead her to orchestrate one of the most dangerous undercover operations in DEA history. What the cartel didn't know was that they had just threatened the wrong woman's family. What they couldn't have predicted was that their $2 million bribe would become the very weapon used to bring down their entire organization. This is the true story of how one prosecutor turned a cartel's biggest mistake into their ultimate downfall, risking everything to deliver justice that was 3 times more devastating than anything they could have imagined. Maria Santos had always believed that justice was worth fighting for, but she never imagined that fight would literally come knocking at her office door on a cold February evening in 2019. As the lead federal prosecutor for the Southern District of Texas, she had spent the last 8 months building what she considered to be an airtight case against the Vega Cartel, one of the most ruthless drug trafficking organizations operating along the Mexican border. The case had consumed her life. Every piece of evidence had been carefully gathered, every witness meticulously prepared, and every legal strategy thoroughly planned. The Vega Cartel controlled nearly 60% of the cocaine and heroin flowing through the Rio Grande Valley, generating an estimated $500 million annually in drug profits. For 3 years, they had operated with near impunity, leaving a trail of violence and addiction in their wake. But Maria had finally assembled enough evidence to take them down. That Tuesday evening, she was working late, reviewing testimony transcripts, when she heard the soft shuffle of footsteps in the hallway outside her office. The federal building was mostly empty at this hour, with only a skeleton crew of security guards making their rounds. She assumed it was just routine patrol until she noticed something unusual. A manila envelope had been slid under her door so quietly that she almost missed it. The envelope bore no return address, no postmark, nothing to indicate its origin. Her name was written across the front in block letters with black ink. Maria's first instinct was to call security, but curiosity got the better of her. She carefully opened the envelope with a letter opener, treating it like potential evidence. Inside were 3 items that would change the course of her life forever. The first was a high-resolution photograph of her 15-year-old daughter Sophia walking home from Jefferson High School. The image had been taken just that afternoon. Sophia was wearing the same blue sweater and carrying the same backpack Maria had seen her leave with that morning. Someone had been watching her daughter, tracking her movements, documenting her daily routine. The second item was a bank statement from a Cayman Islands account, showing a deposit of exactly $2 million made 3 days earlier. The account was listed under her name, complete with her social security number and date of birth. Someone had not only opened an offshore account in her name, but had also already deposited an enormous sum of money into it. The third item was a handwritten note on expensive paper that simply read, "Counselor Santos, your daughter is beautiful. It would be unfortunate if something happened to her. The money is yours. Drop the Vega case. Walk away. Everyone wins. You have 48 hours to decide." Maria's hands trembled as she read the note a second time. Then a third. The threat was clear, direct, and terrifyingly real. Someone had photographed her daughter without her knowledge, opened a bank account in her name, and was now demanding that she abandon the biggest case of her career in exchange for her family's safety. Her first call was to her husband Roberto, a high school math teacher who was at home helping Sophia with her homework. She spoke calmly, not wanting to alarm him, but asked him to check that all the doors and windows were locked and to keep Sophia inside for the rest of the evening. She would explain everything when she got home. Her second call was to FBI Special Agent David Chen, her longtime collaborator on organized crime cases. Chen had been working the Vega investigation alongside her team and had become someone she trusted implicitly over their 5 years of professional partnership. When she explained what had just happened, his response was immediate and decisive. "Maria, you need to pack up and leave the building right now. Don't touch anything else in that envelope, and don't go home tonight. We're going to put you and your family in protective custody while we figure out how they got this close to you." But Maria had a different idea, one that surprised even herself with its boldness. Instead of running, instead of accepting defeat, she wanted to use this threat as an opportunity. The cartel had just revealed their desperation, their fear of her case, and their willingness to take enormous risks to stop her. They had also provided her with something valuable: proof of their attempted bribery and witness intimidation. David, what if we don't run? What if we use this against them instead? Agent Chen was quiet for a long moment. Maria, these people just threatened your daughter. They know where she goes to school, where you live, probably where your husband works. This isn't a game. I know it's not a game, but think about it. They're scared. Really scared. Scared enough to attempt bribing a federal prosecutor and threatening her family. That tells me we're closer to bringing them down than we thought. If we handle this right, we could use their desperation against them. Over the next 2 hours, Maria and Agent Chen developed the framework for what would become one of the most complex and dangerous operations either had ever attempted. Rather than simply reporting the bribery attempt and letting the FBI handle it through normal channels, Maria proposed something far more audacious. She would pretend to accept the bribe. The plan was risky beyond measure, but it was also potentially brilliant. If Maria could convince the cartel that she was willing to be bought, she might be able to gain access to their inner workings in a way that traditional investigative methods never could. She could gather evidence not just about their drug operations, but about their corruption network, their methods of intimidating officials, and potentially other cases they had interfered with. Agent Chen was initially resistant. The plan would require Maria to maintain contact with dangerous criminals who had already threatened her family. It would mean documenting conversations and meetings that could easily go wrong. Most importantly, it would require her to appear corrupt to her colleagues and superiors until the operation was complete. But as they talked through the possibilities, both began to see the potential. The Vega cartel had been operating successfully for years, partly because they had learned how to corrupt the system. They had judges on their payroll, police officers who looked the other way, and customs officials who allowed their shipments to pass through unchecked. If Maria could infiltrate that corruption network, she might be able to expose not just the cartel, but the entire web of officials who enabled their operations. The operation would need approval from the highest levels of the Department of Justice, and it would require a level of security and support that went far beyond anything either had worked on before. But if it succeeded, it could deliver a blow to organized crime that went far beyond just stopping one drug trafficking organization. As the evening turned into night, Maria made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She would not be intimidated. She would not run. Instead, she would turn the cartel's greatest strength, their ability to corrupt officials, into the weapon that would ultimately destroy them. The next morning, she began making the calls that would set an unprecedented undercover operation into motion. She started with her supervisor, District Attorney James Morrison, a man she had worked with for over a decade and trusted completely. Morrison's reaction was exactly what she expected: shock, concern for her safety, and deep skepticism about the proposed operation. Maria, you're talking about pretending to be a corrupt federal prosecutor. Do you understand what that means for your career if anything goes wrong? Do you understand the risk you'd be taking with your family's safety? I understand all of that, Jim, but I also understand that if we don't take this opportunity, the Vega cartel will just find another prosecutor to threaten, another official to corrupt, another family to intimidate. This is our chance to break the cycle. Morrison required extensive convincing, but eventually agreed to support the proposal as it moved up the chain of command. The next call was to the regional FBI director, followed by conversations with officials at the DEA, the Treasury Department, and ultimately the Deputy Attorney General's office in Washington. Each conversation was more complex than the last. The proposed operation would cross multiple jurisdictional lines, involve significant resources, and carry unprecedented risks, but as details of the Vega cartel's attempted bribery spread through law enforcement circles, support for Maria's proposal began to build. The cartel had made a critical miscalculation. They had assumed that threatening a prosecutor and offering her money would be enough to make her back down. They had no way of knowing that Maria Santos had spent her entire career preparing for exactly this kind of fight, or that their desperate attempt to corrupt her would give her the tools she needed to bring them down completely. By the end of that first week, the operation had a name, clean sweep, and a budget that reflected its ambitious scope. Maria would have a team of 12 agents supporting her, sophisticated surveillance equipment to record all her interactions with cartel representatives, and a carefully crafted cover story that would make her corruption appear believable to the criminals she was targeting. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Maria believed about justice, courage, and the price of fighting for what's right. The cartel thought they had bought themselves a corrupt prosecutor. Instead, they had unknowingly recruited the person who would orchestrate their complete destruction. 2 weeks after receiving the threatening envelope, Maria Santos found herself sitting across from Eduardo Vega himself, the cartel leader whose organization she had been prosecuting. The meeting was taking place in an upscale restaurant in downtown San Antonio. a location that Eduardo had chosen specifically because it was public enough to seem safe while private enough for serious conversation. Maria wore a wire so sophisticated that it was virtually undetectable, even to someone specifically looking for surveillance equipment. The FBI team supporting Operation Clean Sweep had spared no expense in ensuring she could document every conversation while maintaining her cover. Agent Chen was positioned at a table across the restaurant, posing as a businessman having lunch, while 3 other agents were stationed at various points around the building. Eduardo Vega was nothing like what Maria had expected. Instead of the crude, intimidating figure she had imagined, he was articulate, well-dressed, and carried himself with the confidence of a successful businessman. He could have easily passed for a corporate executive or successful entrepreneur. This polished exterior made him even more dangerous, as it allowed him to move freely in circles where a more obviously criminal figure would attract attention. Ms. Santos, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. Eduardo began, speaking in lightly accented but perfect English. I hope you found our initial proposal reasonable. Maria had spent days preparing for this conversation, working with FBI behavioral specialists to develop a persona that would be convincing to someone like Eduardo. She needed to appear corrupt enough to be believable, but not so eager that it would raise suspicions. The key was to seem reluctant, as if she was wrestling with her conscience but ultimately willing to be bought. I'll be honest with you, Mr. Vega. What you're asking me to do goes against everything I've spent my career building. But I also can't ignore the reality of my situation. My daughter's safety has to be my priority. Eduardo nodded sympathetically, exactly the response Maria had been hoping for. I completely understand, and I respect you for being honest. We're not unreasonable people, Ms. Santos. We're business people who sometimes find ourselves in conflict with the legal system. But conflicts can be resolved when reasonable people work together.
Over the next hour, Eduardo outlined what he described as a mutually beneficial arrangement. In exchange for Maria dropping the federal case against his organization, she would receive not just the $2 million already deposited in the offshore account, but an additional $500,000 every 6 months for as long as she remained in her position as a federal prosecutor. She would also be expected to provide advance warning about any future investigations targeting his organization or its associates.
The scope of corruption Eduardo was proposing went far beyond what Maria had initially imagined. He wasn't just asking her to drop one case, he was asking her to essentially become a permanent asset for his organization, providing ongoing protection and intelligence for years to come. I need to understand something, Maria said, playing her role carefully. How do I know this arrangement will actually protect my family? How do I know you won't just keep making demands?
Eduardo's response revealed the depth of his organization's corruption network.
Santos, you won't be alone in this arrangement. We have productive relationships with officials at every level of government. Local police, state investigators, federal agents, even judges. You'll be joining a community of people who have found a way to make the system work for everyone. This was exactly the kind of information Maria had hoped to gather. Eduardo was essentially confessing to a massive corruption network that went far beyond anything her original investigation had uncovered. The wire she was wearing was recording every word, providing evidence that could potentially bring down dozens of corrupt officials across multiple agencies. As the meeting continued, Eduardo became increasingly specific about the protection his organization could offer. They had safe houses across 3 states, connections with corrupt officials in Mexico who could facilitate disappearances if necessary, and enough financial resources to relocate entire families if situations became too dangerous. What he was describing wasn't just a criminal organization. It was a shadow government with its own infrastructure, its own rules, and its own system of justice. Maria played her part perfectly, asking the kinds of questions a genuinely corrupt prosecutor might ask. How would payments be made? How would communication be handled? What would happen if other prosecutors were assigned to take over her cases? Eduardo had answers for everything, revealing an organization that had clearly thought through every aspect of corrupting public officials. The meeting ended with Maria agreeing to consider Eduardo's proposal, but expressing the need for certain guarantees about her family's safety. They scheduled another meeting for the following week, giving her time to think things over, while actually giving her time to debrief with her FBI handlers and plan the next phase of the operation. When Maria left the restaurant that afternoon, she had recorded over an hour of Eduardo Vega confessing to bribery, conspiracy, witness intimidation, and revealing details about a corruption network that spanned multiple states and involved dozens of public officials. But this was just the beginning of what Operation Clean Sweep would ultimately uncover. Over the following weeks, Maria's supposed corruption opened doors that legitimate law enforcement had never been able to access. Eduardo introduced her to other members of his organization, including financial specialists who managed the cartel's money laundering operations, logistics coordinators who handled drug shipments, and enforcement specialists who dealt with problems like uncooperative officials or rival organizations. Each meeting provided new intelligence about how the Vega cartel operated, but also revealed the broader ecosystem of corruption that made their success possible.
Maria learned about specific judges who had been bought, police officers who provided advance warning about raids, customs officials who ensured certain shipments passed through without inspection, and prosecutors in other districts who had either been corrupted or intimidated into dropping cases. The most shocking revelation came during a meeting with the cartel's financial coordinator, a woman named Carmen Ruiz who managed their legitimate business investments.
Carmen explained how the organization used a network of shell companies, real estate investments, and even charitable foundations to launder drug money and maintain the appearance of legitimate success. The key, Carmen explained to Maria during a meeting at an expensive Houston hotel, is that we don't just hide the money, we integrate it into the legitimate economy. We own restaurants, construction companies, car dealerships, even a few small banks. Our money becomes clean money and our people become respected members of their communities. This revelation fundamentally changed Maria's understanding of what she was fighting. The Vega cartel wasn't just a criminal organization operating at the margins of society. It was a fully integrated part of the legitimate business community, with connections and investments that reached into every aspect of the local economy. As Operation Clean Sweep expanded, Maria found herself playing an increasingly complex role.
She had to appear corrupt enough to maintain her cover, while actually gathering evidence about crimes ranging from drug trafficking to money laundering to murder. She attended meetings where killings were discussed casually, learned about shipments worth tens of millions of dollars, and heard detailed plans for corrupting additional government officials.
The psychological toll of the operation was enormous. Maria was essentially living two lives. In public, she appeared to be continuing her normal work as a prosecutor, while secretly she was documenting conversations with some of the most dangerous criminals in the region. The stress was compounded by the constant awareness that if her cover was blown, the consequences would be fatal not just for her, but potentially for her entire family. Agent Chen and his team provided extensive support, but Maria was ultimately alone during the most dangerous moments. When Eduardo invited her to witness a meeting with corrupt Border Patrol agents, she had to sit calmly while listening to discussions about allowing drug shipments to pass through federal checkpoints. When Carmen showed her photographs of legitimate businesses that were actually money laundering fronts, she had to express interest rather than disgust. Perhaps the most difficult moment came when Eduardo invited her to attend what he called a problem resolution meeting. Maria arrived at a warehouse outside San Antonio to find Eduardo and three of his associates discussing what to do about a local police detective who had been asking too many questions about their operations. The detective, a man named Rodriguez who had been investigating the cartel independently, was becoming what Eduardo termed a liability that needed to be addressed. Maria listened in horror as the group discussed various options for dealing with Detective Rodriguez, ranging from bribery to intimidation to assassination. She realized that she was not just gathering evidence about past crimes, but was potentially witnessing the planning of a murder. The ethical dilemma was overwhelming. She needed to maintain her cover to protect the larger operation, but she also couldn't allow an innocent person to be killed. Working with Agent Chen, Maria developed a plan to warn Detective Rodriguez without compromising her cover. Using intermediaries and carefully crafted anonymous tips, they were able to alert Rodriguez to the danger he was in and arrange for him to be temporarily reassigned to a different unit while maintaining the appearance that he had been successfully intimidated. This incident highlighted the moral complexity of Operation Clean Sweep. Maria was gathering invaluable evidence about massive criminal activities, but she was also being forced to participate in discussions about serious crimes while appearing to approve of them. Every conversation she recorded brought her closer to building a case that could destroy the Vega cartel and its corruption network, but also required her to compromise her own integrity in ways that were psychologically devastating. As the weeks passed, Maria's supposed corruption allowed her to access increasingly sensitive information.
She learned about the cartel's connections with international smuggling networks, their relationships with corrupt officials in Mexico and Colombia, and their plans for expanding into new territories. The intelligence she was gathering was unprecedented in its scope and detail, providing law enforcement with insights into criminal operations that had previously been completely hidden.
But the deeper she went into the criminal world, the more dangerous her situation became. Eduardo was beginning to trust her enough to include her in planning sessions for major operations, which meant she was becoming directly implicated in serious crimes even though she was working undercover.
The line between playing a corrupt prosecutor and actually being one was becoming increasingly thin, and Maria found herself struggling to maintain her sense of identity and purpose.
The operation reached a critical turning point when Eduardo asked her to do more than just drop cases. He wanted her to actively interfere with other prosecutors' investigations by sharing confidential information and providing advance warning about planned raids and arrests. This request would require Maria to actually commit federal crimes, crossing a line that could destroy her career and potentially land her in prison if the operation was ever exposed.
Agent Chen and the FBI team realized that Operation Clean Sweep was approaching a crossroads. They had already gathered enough evidence to prosecute dozens of people and dismantle significant portions of the Vega cartel's operations.
But Eduardo's latest request suggested that he was beginning to trust Maria enough to reveal the most sensitive aspects of his organization's activities. The question was whether the potential intelligence gains justified the additional risks of having Maria actually commit crimes as part of her cover.
The decision would ultimately be made at the highest levels of the Department of Justice, but Maria knew that whatever choice was made would determine not just the success of the operation, but the rest of her life and career. She had already sacrificed more than she had ever imagined possible in pursuit of justice, but the cartel's latest demands would require her to risk everything she had spent her entire career building.
6 months after Operation Clean Sweep began, Maria Santos sat in a secure conference room at FBI headquarters in San Antonio, surrounded by evidence that would change the landscape of organized crime prosecution forever. Spread across 3 tables were dozens of file folders, hundreds of photographs, thousands of pages of transcripts and computer drives containing enough recorded conversations to fill several libraries.
What had started as a desperate response to a cartel's bribery attempt had evolved into the most comprehensive investigation of organized crime and corruption in the region's history. The scope of what Maria and her team had uncovered was staggering. The evidence they had gathered would ultimately lead to federal charges against 127 individuals across 6 states, including 23 public officials, 15 law enforcement officers, 8 judges, and dozens of cartel members and associates. The corruption network Eduardo Vega had revealed to Maria during their meetings was even more extensive than anyone had imagined, reaching into every level of government from local police departments to federal agencies.
But the most significant breakthrough had come just 2 weeks earlier, when Eduardo made a mistake that would prove fatal to his entire organization. Trusting Maria completely by this point, he had invited her to attend what he called a coordination meeting, a gathering of the cartel's leadership, along with their network of corrupt officials.
The meeting was intended to plan their expansion into new territories and discuss strategies for dealing with increased federal attention on their activities. Maria arrived at the meeting location, a luxury ranch outside Austin, wearing the most sophisticated recording equipment the FBI had ever deployed. What she witnessed over the next 8 hours would provide evidence for what federal prosecutors would later describe as the largest organized crime conspiracy case in Texas history. The meeting included not just Eduardo and his immediate associates, but representatives from cartels in 3 other states, corrupt officials from multiple agencies, and legitimate business people who were knowingly participating in money laundering operations.
Maria watched and recorded as they discussed everything from multi-ton drug shipments to specific murders they had ordered to detailed plans for corrupting additional government officials. The most shocking revelation came when Eduardo introduced Maria to federal Judge Patricia Hawkins, who had been on the cartel's payroll for over 3 years.
Judge Hawkins had been systematically dismissing cases against cartel members, suppressing evidence, and providing advance warning about federal investigations. Her corruption had allowed dozens of dangerous criminals to avoid prosecution and had compromised numerous legitimate investigations.
But Eduardo's biggest mistake was revealing the scope of what he called the cartel's insurance policy. In addition to corrupting individual officials, the organization had been systematically gathering blackmail material on prominent politicians, business leaders, and law enforcement officials across the region. They maintained detailed files on everyone from city council members to federal judges, including photographs, financial records, and evidence of extramarital affairs or other embarrassing behavior. This blackmail network was the cartel's ultimate protection against prosecution. If any official attempted to investigate them seriously, they could be destroyed professionally and personally through the selective release of compromising information.
Eduardo showed Maria several examples of how this system had been used to end careers and destroy lives when officials became uncooperative. The revelation of this blackmail network fundamentally changed the nature of Operation Clean Sweep. Maria and her team weren't just investigating drug trafficking and corruption. They were uncovering a systematic attack on democratic institutions that threatened the rule of law itself. The Vega cartel had essentially created a shadow government, where legitimate officials served at the pleasure of criminal organizations, and decisions about justice were made based on financial considerations rather than legal principles.
As Maria continued recording the meeting, she began to understand that Eduardo had made a critical miscalculation about her character. He had assumed that because she appeared willing to be corrupted, she would eventually embrace the cartel's worldview and become a genuine ally. He began speaking to her, not just as a bought official, but as someone he was grooming for a leadership role in their corruption network.
Maria, Eduardo said during a private conversation near the end of the meeting, I want you to think about your long-term future. You have the intelligence and the position to become much more than just another prosecutor on our payroll.
We need someone who understands both sides of the system, someone who can help us expand our influence into new areas. What Eduardo was proposing was essentially that Maria become the cartel's primary liaison with the federal justice system, using her position and knowledge to systematically corrupt prosecutors, agents, and officials across multiple states. He was offering her a role that would have made her one of the most powerful criminal operatives in the country, with access to millions of dollars and protection that would have allowed her to operate with complete impunity. Maria's response was carefully calculated to maintain her cover while gathering additional evidence. She expressed interest in Eduardo's proposal while asking detailed questions about how such an arrangement would work. Her questions prompted Eduardo to reveal even more sensitive information about the cartel's operations, including their connections with criminal organizations in other countries and their plans for corrupting officials at the federal level in Washington. By the end of that meeting, Maria had recorded over 12 hours of conversations that provided evidence of crimes ranging from drug trafficking to murder to systematic corruption of government institutions. But more importantly, she had gained Eduardo's complete trust, which would prove crucial for the final phase of Operation Clean Sweep. The operation's endgame began 3 weeks later, when Eduardo invited Maria to attend what he described as the cartel's annual planning conference. This gathering would bring together the leadership of multiple criminal organizations, corrupt officials from across the region, and legitimate business people who were part of their money laundering network. Eduardo explained that the conference would finalize their expansion plans for the coming year and establish new protocols for their corruption activities. For Maria and the FBI team, this conference represented an unprecedented opportunity. If they could record the proceedings and identify all the participants, they would have evidence to dismantle not just the Vega cartel, but the entire criminal ecosystem that supported organized crime in the region.
The evidence gathered from this single event could lead to hundreds of prosecutions and completely reshape the landscape of federal law enforcement in the area.
But attending the conference would also represent the most dangerous moment of Maria's undercover career. The gathering would include people from multiple criminal organizations, any of whom might recognize her or become suspicious of her motives. The security would be extensive, making it virtually impossible for FBI agents to provide close protection. If anything went wrong, Maria would be completely on her own, surrounded by some of the most dangerous criminals in the region. The conference was held at a remote ranch in South Texas, far from any major cities and chosen specifically to ensure privacy and security. Maria arrived with recording equipment so sophisticated that it could capture conversations from across large rooms while remaining completely undetectable. Agent Chen and his team were positioned miles away, ready to move in immediately if Maria activated an emergency signal, but essentially powerless to protect her if something went wrong during the actual event. What Maria witnessed over the next 2 days exceeded even her highest expectations for gathering intelligence. The conference included detailed presentations about drug trafficking routes, money laundering techniques, corruption strategies, and expansion plans that involved multiple criminal organizations working together. She recorded conversations that provided evidence of crimes spanning decades and involving hundreds of participants. The most significant breakthrough came when the conference participants discussed their succession planning, essentially their strategies for ensuring that their criminal operations would continue even if key leaders were arrested or killed. These discussions revealed the true scope of their organizations, including backup leadership structures, hidden assets, and contingency plans that had been developed over many years. But the conference also revealed something that even Maria hadn't fully understood before: the extent to which the criminal organizations saw themselves as legitimate businesses that just happened to operate outside the law. The participants discussed market share, competitive strategies, customer service, and operational efficiency with the same vocabulary and concepts used by Fortune 500 companies. They had created sophisticated organizational structures with human resources departments, accounting divisions, and strategic planning committees. This realization was crucial for understanding how to effectively prosecute these organizations.
Traditional law enforcement approaches that focused on arresting individual criminals or seizing specific assets would be insufficient against organizations that had developed such sophisticated structures and contingency plans. The evidence Maria was gathering would be essential for developing prosecution strategies that could actually dismantle these criminal enterprises rather than just disrupting them temporarily.
The conference's final day provided Maria with her most dangerous moment and her greatest triumph. Eduardo announced that he wanted to formally induct her into what he called the organization's inner circle, making her a full partner rather than just a corrupted official.
The induction ceremony would involve taking an oath of loyalty and participating in a ritual that would symbolically bind her to the organization permanently. Maria realized that participating in this ceremony would cross legal and ethical lines that could destroy her career and potentially make her genuinely complicit in the organization's crimes. But refusing to participate would almost certainly expose her as an undercover agent, putting her life in immediate danger. She had to find a way to appear willing while actually avoiding the ceremony. Working with subtle signals she had arranged with Agent Chen's team, Maria indicated that she needed immediate extraction. As the ceremony was about to begin, FBI agents initiated what appeared to be a random law enforcement operation in the area, forcing the conference participants to scatter and abandon their plans. In the confusion, Maria was able to leave with the other participants without arousing suspicion, having avoided the ceremony while maintaining her cover. The evidence Maria gathered during those 6 months of Operation Clean Sweep led to what federal prosecutors called the most significant organized crime takedown in the region's history. The subsequent investigations and prosecutions resulted in convictions for 89 individuals, asset forfeitures totaling over $340 million, and the complete dismantling of 4 major criminal organizations. But perhaps most importantly, the operation's success fundamentally changed how law enforcement approached organized crime investigations. The techniques Maria and her team developed became the model for similar operations across the country, leading to a new era of more effective prosecution of sophisticated criminal organizations. Eduardo Vega himself was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During his sentencing hearing, he finally learned the truth about Maria Santos, that the prosecutor he had tried to corrupt had instead used his trust to build the case that would destroy his entire organization. His reaction was one of grudging respect rather than anger, acknowledging that Maria had outplayed him completely. The impact of Operation Clean Sweep extended far beyond the specific prosecutions it generated. The evidence Maria gathered revealed systematic weaknesses in government institutions that allowed corruption to flourish, leading to comprehensive reforms in how agencies handle background checks, monitor employee behavior, and detect potential compromised officials. Maria Santos received numerous commendations for her work on Operation Clean Sweep, but she was most proud of what the operation represented, proof that integrity and determination could triumph over corruption and intimidation. The cartel had offered her $2 million to abandon justice. Instead, she had used their own corruption against them to deliver justice worth far more than money could ever measure. Years later, when asked about the most important lesson from Operation Clean Sweep, Maria always gave the same answer. They thought they could buy me with money and intimidate me with threats. What they didn't understand was that justice isn't for sale at any price. When they tried to corrupt me, they gave me the tools I needed to destroy their entire organization. Their biggest mistake was underestimating what someone will do when they truly believe in doing what's right.